Today we're going to talk about the quadratic formula, which we are going to use to help solve quadratic equations. The whole goal of chapter 5 is talking about quadratic functions, anything that involves an x squared. The first part of the chapter we worked on graphing, and then we moved to factoring, and finally the last part of the chapter we've been working with solving. So the last section, section 5-6 that we covered last week, dealt with solving using the square root method. So this is another way of solving, except these problems are in a special form and we're going to use a formula to help us solve it. So I'm going to skip warm-up number 1. We're just going to skip right over this, but we're going to look at the warm-up number 2 and talk about solving this problem. It says to evaluate, and we have this expression b squared minus 4ac. And then evaluate when a equals 3, b is negative 6, and c is positive 6. Evaluate means to plug in numbers. So we're going to take these 3 letters and plug them into this expression. So b squared, here's b, that means it's negative 6. I need to put that in parentheses because it's negative, and then we square it. And then it says minus 4. And then we have an a, well the number for a is 3, and we have a c, and the number for c is 6. So evaluate means break down, simplify, try and get it into its smallest value. So the second thing we're going to do now is remember order of operations and PEMDAS. There aren't really parentheses here. I mean, yes there are, but there isn't anything we can do inside the parentheses. So the e represents exponents, and we're going to look at the exponent next. And that's this part right here, negative 6 squared. Remember, when you put that in your calculator, you need to place it in parentheses. So negative 6 times negative 6 is really what negative 6 squared means, and that's 36. And then I have a minus sign, and these back 3 terms are being multiplied. So order of operations, exponents, and then multiplication or division from left to right. So we're going to multiply those 3 numbers together. 4 times 3 is 12, and now I need to multiply 12 times 6, which is 72. So now we have 36 minus 72. And if I take 36 minus 72, place it in your calculator if you need to, you get a negative 36. Evaluating, I should be able to break it down as far as it can go. I now have a number. So we've evaluated that. Number 3 wants us to simplify, which is similar to evaluating, but in this case, we already have numbers plugged in, so we're not plugging numbers into an equation. They're already in there for us, and instead we're just going to try and break this down, again using those order of operations. So when we have a square root, that's kind of like having a parentheses, and we need to do all the stuff underneath the square root. So I'm going to keep the 2 in the front, and I'm going to keep the plus sign. And then I want to look at that square root, and we're going to do those 2 things underneath the square root, 2 steps here. We're going to take 2 squared, which is 4. And then we're going to do those back numbers. And I'm going to treat that as a negative 4 times 1 times negative 2. So I'm going to multiply all of those things together because it's negative 4 times 1 times negative 2. And that makes 8. So a negative 1 times 4 is or negative 4 times 1 is a negative 4. And then I have times a negative 2. So again, that's positive 8. On the bottom, we're also going to do that part. 2 times 1 is 2. So again, we left the 2 in the front by itself. We did 2 steps under the parentheses, and then we did the number on the bottom. So now we're going to continue to simplify, and I'm going to add the numbers inside the parentheses. I'm not doing anything else but adding the numbers inside the parentheses. So the square root, and then 4 plus 8 is 12. Now these problems are a little challenging because it really encompasses everything we've done all year. This is the last section we're doing, so we get through this and then we're done. So there's a lot of stuff going on. So our next step in order to continue to simplify is to look at the square root of 12. I can't do anything with this fraction until I do something with the square root of 12. So I can't do any dividing. I have to work with the square root of 12. And the square root of 12, from what we've done over the last 3 weeks, can be broken down into 2 numbers, one of them being the perfect square of 4, the other one being the square root of 3. So I need to break the square root of 12 down into a perfect square. We are not getting decimals. So I have the 2 in front. I have a plus sign. Now I'm simplifying this even further. The square root of 4 becomes 2. And then I keep the square root of 3. That's what the square root of 12 became. And then I'm still dividing this by 2 on the bottom. There's a lot of 2's in this problem. So here's the last part, which is a little weird. We're going to do a little crisscross applesauce. That's what I call it. We're going to reduce this. This fraction has 2 numbers on the top and 1 on the bottom that's being divided by 2. The 2 numbers on the top are both being divided by 2. And we're going to do a little crisscross. So we're going to go one way, and I'm going to take 2 divided by 2, which makes 1. And then I'm going to do the other way, crisscross. I have a plus sign. 2 divided by 2 also makes 1. And then we still have the square root of 3. We don't divide the square root of 3 because it's a different kind of number. So if I look at this answer, I now have 2 divided by 2, which became 1. I have a plus sign, and then another 2 divided by 2, which became 1. This problem is now simplified. It's no longer as a fraction. I divided all the numbers. I broke down the square root. You cannot add these last 2 numbers together. The one in the front is different from the other one because this one in the back, this guy right there, is connected with a square root of 3. And you can't add them together because they're different types of numbers. We're going to look at problems similar to this today and talk about the quadratic formula. So the quadratic formula is a method used to solve quadratic equations. And the quadratic equations we're looking at are in the form ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. So we factored way back when we were doing factoring, and then we solved. And now we're going to use this other method. And the reason we're using that is because you cannot factor. So these are for problems that we cannot factor. So it's a special way to solve quadratic equations in the form ax squared plus bx plus c that cannot be factored. So there is a little formula. Formulas are nice because in science you have formulas, you plug numbers in and you chug through the problem. And that's what we're going to do as well. I call it plug and chug. So it says let A, B, and C be real numbers. And A is not 0. The solution of the quadratic equation are in the form x equals, so we're solving for x, we're finding a solution. Remember, solving means finding x. That's what the whole year has been, finding x. So we have x equals negative b, and then a plus and a minus sign. That plus or minus sign is there because of the square root. Remember, we really have 2 answers, one on either side of the parabola. Remember, this is a parabola. So we still have that plus or minus to have those 2 answers. And then we have the square root of b squared minus 4 times a times c, and then it's all divided by 2a. So it looks a little confusing. We're going to work through a couple examples today. You're going to practice some tomorrow. We're going to work through a couple more examples on Wednesday, and then you'll practice some more on Thursday. So the first thing we're going to do is go back to the beginning of the chapter, and we're going to talk about what a, b, and c are in this problem. Remember, it's ax squared. Well, there's a 1 in front of the x squared, a bx, and a c. So I'm going to list the numbers. A is 1, b is 3, c is a negative 5. So I have a positive 1, a positive 3, and then a negative 5. I have to place those numbers with, or the sign with the number. And now it says to use the quadratic formula. So plug and chug. It says negative b. Well, my b is 3. Plugging it in, it now becomes negative. That's part of the formula, the negative part. And then I have a plus minus sign. Then we have a square root. Underneath the square root, it says b squared. So I'm going to take 3 and square it. There's a minus sign and a 4. Again, that's part of the formula. And then I have an A, which is 1. And we have a C, which is negative 5. And we're going to plug those numbers in. This is all divided by 2 times, and then it says A, which again is 1. So the first step is to plug the numbers in. That's the plug part. Now we need to chug through the problem and simplify it, which is what we did in the little warm-up above. So you plug and then you chug. All right, so thinking about following order of operations like we did above, the first step is to look underneath the square root, and we're going to do 2 steps here underneath that square root. We're going to take the 3 and square it. 3 squared is 9. And then we're going to multiply those back 3 numbers together. Negative 4 times 1 is negative 4, times negative 5 is plus 20. So negative 4 times 1 times negative 5. So I did 2 things underneath the square root. We squared 3 and we multiplied. In the denominator, I have 2 times 1, and 2 times 1 is 2. So now the second step, continuing, I need to combine those numbers underneath the square root. So x equals negative 3 plus minus. Underneath the square root, we have a 9 plus 20, which makes 29. And then it's divided by 2. The last part is the simplifying part. When I look at the square root of 29, the square root of 29 is just a square root of 29. And it cannot be simplified. It's prime. There's no numbers that divide into 29. So you are done with your problem. You are done simplifying. This is our final answer, which looks way different than the numbers we've been working with. Now, if you remember from the last section, we still had square roots left in our problem, but they weren't fractions. So now we have fractions left in the problem as well. So that's our answer. All right, let's see if we can look at B. Going to do the same exact thing, working through the problem. Solve using the quadratic formula, and I'm going to start listing A, which is 1, B, negative 5, C, negative 7. Remember that negative needs to stay with the number. And now we're using that quadratic formula, which I can look at right here, putting it in my screen. Now I see it. So it says negative B. Well, B is negative 5, and if I plug that in for something negative, I know that becomes positive 5. So a negative negative 5 is a plus 5. Then we've got the plus or minus sign, and now we have the square root. B squared, because it's negative, I'm putting it in parentheses and then a little squared. Minus 4, that was part of the equation, the formula, and then A, C. I'm plugging the numbers in for A and C. Divided by 2 times A, which is 1. So that's our plug part. We're plugging in now, chugging through the problem. So you plug numbers in, and now we need to simplify. We're going to follow the same simplifying steps that we did for the problem right next to it on the left. So the first part, when we're simplifying, is to do underneath the square root, and that's negative 5 squared, which means negative 5 times negative 5, or if you put it in your calculator, place parentheses around it. So that's 25. And then I'm multiplying those back numbers. Negative 4 times 1 times negative 7. Negative 4 times 1 is negative 4. Negative 4 times negative 7 is positive 28. On the bottom, 2 times 1 is 2. So really I did 3 things there in one step. We did the exponent, we did multiplying on the top, and now we did multiplying on the bottom. All right, continuing to simplify. Still working with that square root. We need to add 25 and 28 together. Grab that calculator. 25 plus 28. That makes 53. And then it's divided by whatever number was on the bottom, which is 2. The last thing I need to think about is, does any number go into 53? So 53, I don't think 4, nope, 9, nope, 16. No 25, no, none of the perfect squares go into 53. So, woohoo, we're done. So that problem is now simplified. All right, we're going to look at the next set of examples. Looking at the next page here. So again, solve, use the quadratic formula to solve. This time it says it's going to have one answer. And notice this is a little different here. We have x squared minus 6x equals negative 9. Well, the other two problems we just did were equal to 0. And these need to be equal to 0. So we have to make sure we set them equal to 0 first. That's a really big, important thing. Have to have equal to 0 for the quadratic formula to work. So we're going to look at example 2a. See if I can get this equal to 0. If there's a negative 9 and I want it to be 0, I would add 9 to take it to the other side. Now remember, if we're adding 9 to the other side, I need to make sure this is in the proper order. So I need to have x squared first, my 6x, which is negative, second, ax squared plus bx plus c. That's the order that it needs to be in. Equals 0. And then my plus 9 is third. None of them are like terms. They're all different, so I just line them up next to each other. Now we're going to use, so now I'm using the quadratic formula, and I'm going to write the quadratic formula again, just so we have it on this screen. Negative b plus or minus the square root b squared 4 times a times c, and then divided by 2a. So now, plug and chug. I'm going to look here and think about a, there's a 1 in front, b, negative 6, c, positive 9. Plug in the numbers. So a negative b, it's a negative 6 already, and if I plug it in for something that's negative, it becomes a positive 6. And then I have a plus or minus sign. We got the square root. B squared, well, it's negative 6. I'm placing it in parentheses, squared, minus 4 times a times c. And then on the bottom, 2 times a, which is 1. Plug them in, chug through the problem. Keeping the 6 in front, I got the plus or minus sign, we've got the square root. Doing the squared part first. Negative 6 squared is really negative 6 times negative 6. Place parentheses around it in your calculator, that makes 36. The back three numbers, negative 4 times 1 times 9. Place that in your calculator too. That gets a negative 36. And then on the bottom, 2 times 1 is 2. Okay, let's continue to work here. Doing good so far. Next step is to look underneath the square root and combine those two numbers. 36 minus 36 is 0. And then it's divided by 2. Well, now I have to try and simplify this. And the square root of 0 is 0. So I have 6 plus or minus 0, which is nothing. So this part here is 6 plus or minus 0. And then it's divided by 2. Well, plus or minus 0 doesn't make sense for us to write that, so it's really just 6 divided by 2, which I get one answer of 3, and it said I should have one answer. So I just have one nice answer now, and that one nice answer is 3. So that one worked out way better than the other two. We're going to do one last problem today, and then tomorrow again you'll have some problems like this to practice. So same thing, starting out, I need this to say ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. It says equals negative 16 right now. So we're going to add 16. Writing it in the proper order, ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. 16 minus 16 is 0. All right, thinking about what these numbers represent here. There's a 1 in front, so a is 1, b is negative 8, and c is 16. Now I need to plug them into the problem. So negative b, well, b is negative 8, Making it negative again is a positive 8 plus or minus. It's negative, I'm placing it in parentheses and squaring it. Minus 4 times A times C. And then on the bottom, 2 times A. All right, looking good so far. Simplifying, keeping the 8, looking at the square root. Negative 8 squared, remember parentheses around the negative 8, positive 64. And then those three numbers being multiplied. We have a negative 4 times 1 times 16. Put that in your calculator. Negative 4 times 1 times 16 is negative 64. On the bottom, 2 times 1 is 2. So this problem is working out great. Gonna just go up here on the side here. We have an 8 plus or minus, and then underneath the square root, again, 64 minus 64 is 0. And then we're still dividing it by 2. So we just said in the previous problem, if you add or subtract 0, it means nothing. So the only thing we have left, because that's cancels, is 8 divided by 2, which is 4. So x is equal to 4. So you've got to see 4 problems like this. And hopefully you kind of get an idea as to plugging in the numbers and then chugging through the equation and the steps to use. You must do it this way. You must solve the problems in this format using the quadratic formula and have the steps that I have listed here. You can't take any shortcuts. I need to see the work and the steps. So when I look at your problem, I should see the exact same steps. So I need to see the two numbers underneath the square root that you're subtracting. I then need to see when you subtract those two numbers, that value that you get. Please make sure you're following this process. Have a great day. Tomorrow, I'll have a little short video explaining the worksheet.